The agenda this week checked in on the raucous caucuses of Iowa, tallied the cost of political fundraising here at home, and analyzed Toronto's newest subway plan. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Canada's obligations in the Middle East. Janice, start off here. Are we, in your view, breaking our word to our coalition partners by unilaterally deciding, as Mr. Trudeau has done, that our bombing missions of ISIS targets is over?
No, I do not think we are breaking our word. The Prime Minister has made it clear that although we are withdrawing the 6 combat aircraft, and that was a campaign commitment, we will participate actively in the coalition against ISIS. And in fact, we will step up our role. What will be interesting to watch here, Steve, is it a non-combat role, as he has specified in the campaign? And if it is a non-combat role, will that satisfy a very determined Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who said in the US, who said absolutely directly, I will call on every one of my allies to step up, and we cannot tolerate free riders. This has to be a robust commitment to substitute for those planes that are coming home.
But essentially, you say we're not breaking our word by changing this.
I say we are not breaking our word.
Irvin, are we breaking our word by deciding not to bomb ISIS targets any further?
Well, Steve, first of all, congratulations on putting together this wonderful panel, and congratulations on the new set, and it's terrific to do it with Janice, whom I greatly admire. We're not breaking our word, but it's a very disappointing move. I speak strictly from a nonpartisan perspective as an analyst, cheering for the success of the new Prime Minister and the new government. It's a young government. It's a wrong first step in the following sense. Janice takes a very American-centric view of the international affairs universe. Let me take a slightly broader view, which is to say there are 2 major conflicts in the world today. One is the Russia-Western conflict, starting over Ukraine, but broadening to other theaters. The other one is the general collapse of the Middle East. What we have in the context of Syria bombardment is a unification of these 2 conflicts. Now, Canada has put itself into a corner of irrelevance on the first conflict, in the Russia-West conflict. And now we're putting ourselves into a corner of complete irrelevance on the second one. We have a dog in neither fight. In the first context,
us to be more relevant?
We have a duty to be relevant internationally. We have an interest nationally to shape some of these theaters. In both cases, unfortunately, in the first case of irrelevance under the last government, we were speaking to a domestic constituency. The current move, again, is an electoral move which speaks to a domestic constituency, but it, again, redounds to our general detriment. In the first context of the Russia-West conflict, we've got the Minsk process led by France and Germany. Canada should have been there. In my view, we could have been one of the leaders. We had a lot to offer. The next conflict is led by the Vienna process. Almost all the countries that are bombarding various interests in Syria are part of that. Canada could have had a dog in that fight, could have had a role in shaping that universe. We've made ourselves irrelevant.
Okay, the allegation is we are rendering us irrelevant.
Yeah, well, I don't agree. I do not think that we're irrelevant in this, in the larger context of the Middle East. It is not necessary to bomb to be relevant. And I think that's a very important part. There are many different ways that Canada can contribute to the fight against ISIS. Let me give you one concrete example. It's entirely possible that this government will decide to commit troops in a serious way to the Sahel area in Africa, where the Islamic State is expanding out of Libya. It may well join with the French government that has troops in 5 African countries.
You think Canada is going to put boots on the ground?
I think that Canada may well put some forces on the ground in an area which is being neglected and which will be very important as ISIS is pushed out of Iraq and Syria and is now already moving some of its fighters into Libya. And Libya is, as the French president says, the autoroute for fighters to go down and destabilize Mali, Burkina Faso, where 5 Canadians were killed yesterday.
I have to follow up on this. If we're not prepared to put 6 planes in the sky over IS, what makes you think we're going to put any boots on the ground over there?
Well, we already have boots on the ground. We have 69 pairs of boots right now who are training Peshmerga Kurdish forces. It's entirely conceivable that the government, and it said we are going to enhance our training. That's got to mean more boots.
And is that relevant? Would that be considered relevant?
I think that the coalition would be absolutely delighted to see an area where everybody is now very concerned about what's happening in Libya, where the Islamic State is consolidating new bases along a 150-mile stretch of coast. That would be the heart of relevance.
Would this be considered a
There
relevant?
are enough planes in the sky over Syria.
Is that a relevant contribution in your view, if we were to do that?
It's possible. It's highly unlikely. So I think Janice might be overstating the probability of this action. But let me just emphasize that bombing is not relevance. I agree with that. What is relevant is assets. We have no assets, either diplomatic or military, in the Russia-Western conflict. We have no diplomatic assets in the Middle Eastern conflict. We've withdrawn all our military assets. What have we to offer? The point is, if we look at the diplomatic instrument, which reigns in the Vienna process, we have no relationships with Iran. We have no relationship with Syria. We have no relationship in Libya. We have no relationship in Iraq. And we have consulates in a number of key states in the Middle East where we should have embassies. We have very little intelligence, so as a result, we end up quoting American secretaries of state to the detriment of our national interests and our national imagination.
A lot of people taking delight in the fact that Trump didn't win, since he talked so much about we're going to win all the time when I'm president.
Yeah.
Do you take delight in that?
Look, I don't take delight in any of this. That this is invested a lot of my life in the Republican Party, a lot of my life in conservative politics. What I want to see are conservative parties and conservative governments in English-speaking countries that can govern effectively, govern in the interests of the middle class and of productive enterprise, and that can build a message that is both inclusive and modern. And the Republican Party has failed to do that for some time. But I don't see Donald Trump as the villain of the story. I see him as a symptom of a bigger problem. He's stepping into a gap that was created for him. And when you get baffled or irritated or offended by things he said, the question I ask is, why was that space available for him to say them?
We will pick up on that in a second, but I've never known how to pronounce this guy's last name. Ross from the New York Times.
Ross Douthat, yes.
Douthat? Is that how he says it?
Douthat, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Douthat.
Ross Douthat had this to say on Twitter last night. He said, Trump had a ceiling. He always had a ceiling. I told you he had a ceiling. I told you, I told you, I told you, I told you, I told you. I laughed, but I told you.
Yes.
Is he right?
He's right. Look, we know that Trump, of the people seeking the Republican nomination, is the second most unpopular after Jeb Bush. The number who say I would never vote for him, and it's close to 2/3 of the party who say they would never vote for him. And they're the 2/3 most likely to show up. They're the most educated, they're the most affluent, and they're the most religious. Those are the people who don't like him. But I can't be as gleeful about it as Ross can, because for all the things about Trump that have been ugly and divisive and destructive, he has also offered the hope of a necessary cleansing. The problem is the Republican Party message that has been in place since the early 2000s, and especially since 2007, has been ineffective. It's been bad politics and bad government. But the party has been frozen. How many times have we talked about this? I've been banging a big drum in every forum I can get about the obsolescence of this message, that it's a message that was fine for 1985, not fine for now. And the party's found it impossible to change. And one of the things that this Trump rebellion has done is forced Republican leaders to begin to confront that their message is rejected not only by the country, but by very important parts of their own party.
Let me follow up on the Rubio angle now. For those who have been looking for a champion
Yes.
of the non-Cruz, non-Trump part of the Republican Party, have they found it now in this guy?
Well, if what you're looking for is somebody presentable, somebody who does not gratuitously offend people, someone who has an uplifting personal story, someone who's eloquent and seems to be part of 21st century America, then Marco Rubio is all of those things. But his message is not culturally modern. I mean, he is someone who is pro-life, which is where the party is, but also he opposes even rape and incest exceptions. He continues to want to wage the fight against same-sex marriage. Ted Cruz told donors in a recorded meeting and he's supposedly the most culturally conservative, that same-sex marriage would not be a priority for him. But for Marco Rubio, battling that battle remains a priority. More to the point, he does not have the broadly inclusive economic message that the Republican Party needs. He's got the biggest tax cut of them all, and it's weighted toward the very top. And although he's shown some interest in some of the glimmerings of new ideas about how to make things better for the middle class that are incubating in some Republican circles, he's not very bold about it, not very creative. So he is a favorite of the donor community. He is a favorite of the Congressional Party, in part because they hate Ted Cruz so much. But the idea that he is a candidate of modernization, that's not true. He is really a candidate of continuing, of dressing up the politics of Mitt Romney in new clothes.
Have you endorsed anybody yet?
I think you can either comment on the race or bet on the ponies, but not both.
So you are not betting?
I'm commenting on the race.
You're commenting
so I'm not
on the
betting.
race. Well, you did have this to say about Republican donors whom you just mentioned. You wrote, "One of the more dangerous pleasures of great wealth is that you never have to hear anyone tell you that you are completely wrong." Have the last rather few months taught them what they haven't wanted to hear?
Well, a lot of these people are acquaintances or even friends of mine, and they are very smart people. You also don't accumulate great wealth without great brains, and they have great skills in their chosen area. But there have been a series of dogmas and taboos that have gripped the donor community, and some of them pretty obviously untrue, but it's been very convenient to believe them. So, for example, after the 2012 race, the 2012 defeat, which caught so many Republicans by surprise, the party did an exhaustive self-examination. There was even a formal commission, and the conclusion it came to was there is nothing wrong with Mitt Romney's core message. The celebration of entrepreneurship, the desire to have eliminate the health care guarantee that was passed in the first Obama term. None of that was a problem. The problem was the party's stance on immigration, which is the thing the donors had never liked anyway. They want a more open immigration policy, cheaper labor. That's the one thing we have to change. And so the idea that has gripped the donor community in the past since 2013 has been, if only the Republican Party would soften on immigration, all would be well. And that's just obviously not true. I mean, just think about it for a minute. Mexican Americans and Central Americans, these are the two largest immigrant communities, and they're poor. They're very poor. Those of them who have legal status are heavily dependent on government programs. They have low levels of education into the second and even the third generation. It takes 4 generations for Mexican immigrants to catch up to the American average in terms of degree of college education. They depend on the programs that the Democratic Party champions. Why would they vote Republican? Poor people are just as entitled as rich people to vote their pocketbooks. They're just as likely as rich people to vote their pocketbooks. And so the Republican idea that the only barrier between the Republican message and this community was immigration was obviously unrealistic. It was convenient to believe because it spared the party the need to think about things that were uncomfortable, but it was false.
It was supposed to be the biggest public transit infrastructure project in Scarborough's history, a nearly $4 billion 3-stop subway that would connect the inner city with the Scarborough town centre. All 3 levels of government supported it, despite the fact that planners and urban experts thought it made no logical sense at all. But what we didn't know was that behind the scenes, a lot was going on to make a problematic plan better. And the 65th Mayor of Ontario's capital city, John Tory, joins us now to explain how that all happened. Your Worship, welcome back to TVO.
Nice to be here, Steve. Thank you.
Well, you were here 8 months ago, and we did talk about the Scarborough subway, and here is what you had to say on that occasion. Sheldon, roll the clip, please.
I think on the principle of building a subway, all 3 governments made decisions on that. In fact, all 3 of them had elections since they took that position, and in all cases, those who took the positions were re-elected. You know, so it's hard to sort of say, well, gosh, there's this huge groundswell against this. I think people are saying you made a decision for once in your lives, you politicians, stick to it and actually do something.
What changed?
Well, first of all, I would say not much, because if you looked at what I was saying there, which is that we should stick to something, namely building a subway to Scarborough, and do something and get on with it, that's what we're doing. But did we take the opportunity, based on some professional advice offered by our planning staff and others, to make it better? Yes, we did. Is that part of your obligation when you're in a position of responsibility like mine? I believe so. And so that's exactly what we did. But the principle of what was being spoken about then, 8 months ago, and today, and before that, which is a subway to Scarborough, an extension to the Bloor Danforth subway line, that's what we're doing.
One of the things in that interview you also said to me was, the universe will unfold as it should. And I wonder in hindsight whether you were trying to sort of subtly tell me, we're not done with this story.
The answer is yes, because from the time I was sworn in, I started to talk to the provincial people in particular, because I knew that there were ways we probably could improve the subway. And I will tell you, at the beginning, there wasn't much take-up on the whole notion of even suggesting there was any better way to do this. And I'm not being critical in saying that. I just understood completely. They were saying, you know what, this issue has been settled through a number of different elections. I mean, I got elected saying I would build it. The provincial people did, the federal people did. But as time went on, and with the help of our professional staff, including Jennifer Keesmaat, we did find what I believe to be a better way. And we went out then and talked to all the same people, and they all sort of said, yeah, you know, this has some legs. And so I think when you find something like that that can be better, but that, you know, maintains the integrity of the principle you were talking about, which is the extension of subway rapid transit into Scarborough, then you should float it and put it out in front of people.
This seemed, though, the previous plan seemed pretty set in stone. So I wonder sort of who made the first move to reopen the notion that maybe there's a better way?
I did. When I say I did, we did, Toronto, and we went to the province, and then we went to the feds, and we, as I've described it, we kind of went in broadening concentric circles of people. And, you know, the last step in this before we took it public, because frankly, had the reaction been different, Steve, we might not have done it, but we went to the Scarborough councillors and sort of said, so, and other city councillors, and said, so what do you think of this? And when the response was overwhelmingly positive, it having been positive everywhere else, that's when we knew we could take it forward. And one of the objectives of it was, yes, to build a subway, and yes, now to build other rapid transit that will serve other parts of the east end of the city, but also to develop a broader consensus, because this was a war. I mean, and it was a war sort of attrition, where sooner or later somebody was going to perhaps move a motion that might have resulted in this subway being canceled from the city's perspective.
Well, it only passed by what, 2 votes?
Yeah,
anyway?
and you know, so I knew that it was at risk, and I knew what I wanted to do certainly was to find a way to solidify the connection to the rest of the city by subway rapid transit, and at the same time get this consensus. And I think we're on the way to doing that now.
The new plan. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting, because when Maddie was talking about the political process and the planning process sometimes not being the same thing, this is ultimately about the democratic process. And it is not a paint-by-numbers exercise. We know that there are iterations, we know that there are twists and turns, but we also have seen with this new plan, it would seem a culmination of factors from transit experts to media experts who follow this topic, to politicians of all stripes that are getting in line behind what appears to be a pretty good deal, not only for Scarborough and that region, but for the regional transportation system as a whole.
Is there any question in your mind that this plan is better than the previous plan?
Well, what I would look for in any plan, Steve, are 3 things. 1, does it meet the needs of the now and of the future? 2, can we afford it? And that's also, I think, an important piece in making sure that all 3 orders of government are in line with this plan, not just local politicians, but all orders of government. And I think the 3rd is, does it meet the regional needs? You know, 2.4 million trips a day cross municipal boundaries. So this is just as much a matter of what's good for Scarborough as what's good for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region as a whole.
Okay, so that's 3 different factors. On the new plan, what are you going to give it? Is it 3 for 3? Is it 2 for 3? What do we think?
Well, we still have some details to work out. As we know, it's going to get another layer of study, and it's coming back to council for some final vote. But I am very optimistic that this is a strong start in an effective plan that will hopefully see shovels in the ground very, very soon.
Okay. Cherise, the new plan versus the old plan. Better?
Definitely better.
Definitely better.
I
Okay.
think an operative word here is it's a plan. It's the beginnings of a plan. What we had before was simply a 3-stop subway, which didn't cover much ground. So now, because we've scoped down the subway to 1 stop, it's freed up over $1 billion to invest in transit that does cover more ground, 17 stops along Kingston Road up to the university campus. It covers 5 priority neighborhoods, and together that plan of the subway, 1-stop subway, and the LRT will serve 50,000 more residents and 5,000 more jobs than the original plan, which is great. But also the LRT is shovel ready. We can actually start building out there. So yes, it's a much better plan. Is it a political compromise? Yes. It's still $2 billion for one-stop subway. But I think we have to look at the positives, that we have started to move into the territory of evidence-based planning, that we still have this kernel of political compromise in there, but we are crossing that threshold and starting to listen to evidence. And a really good example of that happened last week as well was John Tory's decision to go with expert opinion on the western portion of the Smart Track and how it gets to the airport. The original plan was to take the GO Rail heavy line and move it to the airport, which would have been somewhere between $3.6 and $9 billion because of the tunneling and new tracks and lots of community impact. But the expert report said, why don't you just continue the crosstown LRT? It'll only be $1.3 billion and serve 20,000 more riders. So, and he said yes. So I'm really hopeful that we're starting to move into this new territory called evidence-based planning, and that we'll do that for the future.
This is, what do you want to call it? Maddie, is that a different way of doing business? I mean, in the past, politicians have often taken pride in the fact that even if they were wrong, at least they were firm in their beliefs, and they were rewarded for that. We're in a different day now?
Well, and they were bringing home the bacon to their constituencies. This was the old pork barrel model that you don't just build transportation to move people, you also do it to win votes. And this has been, there's a long history of this in transportation. I think this plan starts to move us on the path, and the language that John Tory and others are using about evidence, I think, is really important. This plan needs to now be subjected to evidence. There's actually, behind all of the bluster and all the rhetoric, there's actually very little study, at least in the public domain. I think we need a lot of study to really scrutinize what this plan offers and what the potential it has to deliver in three key areas. First, what are the ridership opportunities actually associated with this plan? Usually when you build transit, you want to move people. How many people are we really talking about? The second part is on the cost. How much is it going to actually cost to build this project?
I think we know more than what they say, because that's the way it works.
Well, we're hearing that they're taking out parts of the plan and that's going to save money. How much money does it save to take out 2 stations and limit a bit of the tunneling? What are the real numbers on that? And does that offset the additional cost of the line out to University of Toronto Scarborough? And then the third part is on the land use development. A lot of this plan is spoken about as a community development exercise in Scarborough Town Centre. We really need to understand the connection now between transportation and land use. And also, could we achieve those benefits either with other policy tools or by merging policy tools with the transit? We really need to now move from the land of politics into the world of evidence-based assessments to really understand if this plan holds up to scrutiny.
Do you think for a $10,000 donation to a party, you're necessarily going to get everything you want?
Well, it's hard to say, but I will have to give you some concrete examples. Okay, Midhurst mega development, 16 exemptions to the Places to Grow Act, the government's own legislation to allow a mega development to quadruple the size of a little village. The big developer who got his way, huge donor to the Liberal Party. $100,000.
Don't get us sued here, Mike.
No,
Don't
I'm not,
get us
but
sued.
But I'm just saying, so who knows if that had influence or not, but people have asked questions about it. $100,000 private dinner, Bruce Power, with the Premier and the Energy Minister, and then the Darlington new build gets canceled a few months later. Whether or not those events actually led to changes in public policy, the perception that they led to changes in public policy erodes confidence in government, erodes confidence in our democracy, and we have to fix that. The federal government, I think the Chrétien and Martin Liberals, they came up, I thought, with a great system that was a blending of the two. We still had private donations from individuals, not corporations and unions. People vote, not corporations and unions. So citizens could still donate to political parties. I think that's an important part of the political process. Lower the contribution limits to a lower level to make it a fair playing field. And then also add a public subsidy to it as well, Greg, so you have a blend.
Greg, you wrote about this in your book, that when you were actually in the caucus of the government of Ontario, people in the caucus actually wanted to do this.
Yep.
And you said to them, what?
I said, have you gone completely crazy? And the reason was simple. This was 2002. We did not have fixed election dates. We thought that we would be into an election campaign within about 6 months. We were deeply in debt, and I was about to go to the banks to say, would you lend us $8 million so that we can launch a campaign. If I had to go to those banks and say, will you lend us $8 million? And by the way, we are cutting off our major source of contributions, they would have said, how could we possibly do that? And I just tried to make the point in the book, and I will make the point here, that if you want to transition to another system, do it in a way that is fair to all parties, is timely, and to go back to the problem that I identified at first, deals with the problem that all political parties do not have the resources under the current system to do what they want to do. Now, we talk about let's get rid of corporate donations. Guess who would be happiest if we eliminated corporate donations?
Corporations.
The corporations of the province of Ontario. Now, for Mike to suggest that somehow the fact that the good people of Bruce Power, who have been supporting both parties and were created under a conservative government.
I noticed that.
Just so you know.
Yeah.
No, but that somehow launching a dinner where the Liberal Party of Ontario benefited to the tune of $100,000 would influence the government on making decisions on nuclear power that involve billions of dollars
Can I ask
of
the flip side,
expenditure.
though? How would it not? How
Well,
would it not influence them?
Because the issues related to what we are going to do with our electricity down the line, whether at Bruce or Darlington, are so complex, are reviewed by energy boards, are reviewed by bureaucrats, and have huge implications. I've been to those dinners with Bruce Power and I can't remember the president's name.
Duncan Hawthorne.
Duncan
just
Hawthorne.
retiring.
We never, at those dinners, we never talked about nuclear energy. It just really wasn't even on the table. It was, how are things going here?
But I'd say, go ahead, Francis. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to come to a slightly different point, which is why the heck would Bruce be spending any money giving to political parties when you know that that's going to go into their cost of overhead and go before the OEB and become part of a rate application, et cetera, et cetera.
So why do they do it?
Why? Well, that's a good question. And what are the relationships? There are lots of relationships, not so much the money, but relationships that help people have access and influence. And I think that's more important in getting what they want than the money that goes over.
Yeah, but for instance, just to your point on Bruce Power spends millions of dollars advertising to the public.
I think they should.
And so $100,000 in political donations, I'm sure they've given to the Conservative Party. I think they have given to the NDP party.
No, the NDP is anti-nuclear. I don't think they give to them.
I hope they've given to the Green Party, but probably not.
No.
But the fact is that they do that to basically enhance their overall brand.
Yeah, but it's not just that. But one of the things that makes a successful government is to be able to have access to all, to different sources of information, to be able to sit down at a dinner, minister to group, and talk about the issues in some depth without media cameras hanging over you. I understand the issue of perception, and that is an important issue, and I think however we do it, change rules to try and fix that, we need to. But let's not do what changes to the lobby registry, the lobby rules have done, is to cut off the interchange between people in all kinds of groups and government, because you can't have a government relying solely on your bureaucracy and good people doing good stuff.
We get that you've got to meet.
You've got to have that interchange.
But I've seen emails that have gone out, for example, from drug companies to their stakeholders saying, give us X number of thousands of dollars and come meet the Minister of Health and we'll have a chance to discuss the issues that are front and center on our agenda right now.
And they will, and they'll discuss them, but that doesn't mean that the minister then goes back to cabinet in all cases and says, gee, we're going to do what this drug company wanted. No. Right now, if I was a drug company, given what Deb Matthews did with beating back on the name brand guys, I'd be asking for my money back, right? So, it doesn't necessarily buy you the decision. I said, getting in the door, yes, it can influence getting in the door, but it doesn't
Can we just step back to the whole issue of what the perception is? Greg said this is not one of the top issues in the province. I think it's one of the top issues for the brand of the Liberal Party.
Yes.
I think Kathleen Wynne is a person of integrity. I think the stuff that's gone on, if you add it all up, gives a hit to the integrity part of the Liberal brand that is near fatal Personally, I think that. And I think that it gives all politicians and all political parties a hit. So I think I come back to this question of integrity. I think that they're pushing it way too far. And I think it should change because I think people are fed up with it. It may be that that's how we've always done it. We may have a really profound belief that we weren't influenced in any way to make decisions because of those donations. But the public just doesn't believe that anymore, and they're already so disengaged. We need to do something to contribute to rebuilding a faith in democracy.
We're talking about Alberta as no longer being an energy superpower. It could be the 21st century energy superpower for Canada because it's also the solar capital of the country and right at the cutting edge of R&D through their universities and through their innovation hubs. So we need to pivot as much as the world needs to pivot, and we can.
But when Stephen Harper talked about Alberta as an energy superpower, he didn't mean solar, he meant fossil fuel.
But we can be any kind of energy superpower if we decide that we're joining the global pivot. That transformation is happening with or without us.
Gotcha.
I think what's really interesting also, though, if you look at Canada and you look at other rich countries, stable democracies that have been blessed with vast natural resources, very few make a conscious decision to not exploit those natural resources and to invest strategically ahead of the curve in the kinds of things you're talking about. If you look at Norway, you look at Australia, I mean, even New Zealand is getting hurt by the price of dairy. Countries that have this wealth of natural resources tend to rely heavily on that blessing. And then when the bust comes, it's like the same story all over again. Why didn't we do something else?
But Norway is actually a particularly interesting example because it's leading the charge on divestment. So this is raising a whole other economic and business issue, which is one of stranded assets. So if the shift is happening faster...
Stranded assets meaning?
Meaning that you've got all this investment in production, but that's not where the market's heading. The market, I mean, we have city groups saying that oil is going to drop to 20. Some wild cards out there saying it's going to drop to 10. It may rebound, but it's not going to rebound to its former glory. We are looking at companies that, I mean, you were talking about why U.S. is still producing. Frankly, it needs to produce to generate cash. We're looking at, is when the cash is gone that they're going to stop producing. And we're looking at a very profound transition in this industry.
Let me do one more thing on this and then we'll talk deficits. And that is, obviously what's happening to the oil sector is terrible for Alberta, but it's made our dollar cheaper and therefore theoretically ought to be boosting manufacturing and essentially the economy here in the province of Ontario. And you wonder whether, have you got anything that suggests that the losses in Alberta are being more than adequately offset by economic improvements in Ontario?
I mean, I'd love to hear that argument, and maybe Armin can make it. I think we've heard the Governor of the Bank of Canada is probably the best positioned person to articulate what's going on here, and he continues to say that this rebalancing is going to take a very long time. It hasn't happened as quickly as some might have thought. I think we're seeing some signs of improvement, but the capacity for manufacturing, in other words, a lot of factories closed. We know this. We wrote about this. They were headlines all over Ontario, Quebec particularly, very hard hit for more than a decade. Before the price of oil pushed up the dollar, this was happening. And it wasn't just happening in Canada, it was happening in the United States also. Places like Mexico competing, also all over Asia. That's not going to turn around overnight.
A word on that, Armin?
Yeah, in fact, the rebalancing is beginning to happen just today in the newspapers. People were talking. The business pages were saying that the dollar is decoupling from being a petrodollar strictly to starting to look like it's starting to decouple. We've seen Cisco set up its North American hub for IT in Toronto because we're connected to innovation. A lower dollar means lower relative wages.
Just Cisco got huge subsidies from the Ontario government to come
not
here
huge,
as well.
Compared to their sunk costs. Yes,
Okay.
some subsidies, but not huge, and any jurisdiction in North America would have given them subsidies. So we landed it because of our ability to connect with advanced manufacturing in Southern Ontario and the other innovation hubs in Ottawa, in Waterloo, in Toronto. So we are a magnet for advanced manufacturing right now. The low dollar means low relative wages. Those old manufacturing jobs, The legacy jobs may not come back, but this is a real ticket. A low dollar and low relative wages means more tourism. It means more advanced manufacturing. It might even be enough of an interesting feature of Southern Ontario's auto sector, because there's some big reinvestments that are being reconsidered. We've got the people, we've got the most productive plants. Maybe this is the time to reinvest in auto, but even if we don't, there's other things like Hollywood North. Film industry is going nuts here, always does when the dollar drops. But will it be enough to offset what's happening in Alberta? I'll tell you one thing that's enough to completely kill the offset, which is if Bombardier goes belly up. 20,000 jobs in Quebec alone, also high-tech, well-paid, and that compares to 18,000 jobs lost thus far in the oil sector. So we are looking at lots of different moving parts. The low dollar isn't all that's happening. There's a lot of other massively competitive industries, and Bombardier is getting its throat stepped on by Airbus and Boeing. So that will bode very poorly, irrespective of a low dollar.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.